and welcome everybody to our Ask the Expert Supporting Children with Autism Spectrum Disorder. We are here with Amy Orlando, and I'm just going to read a little bit about Amy. Amy has over 10 years of experience working with clients with ADHD and autism of all ages. She is an occupational therapist and executive functioning and life coach at the Chesapeake Center. She received her undergraduate degree at the University of Notre Dame in psychology and her master's at Tufts University. She is a certified and licensed, again, occupational therapist and is certified through the LEND program, which is Leadership, Education, and Neurodevelopmental Disabilities. Amy is here with me, Julianne. I'm our Director of Outreach and Communications at Chesapeake, and I'm so excited to have her talk about this very important topic. So, Amy, I'll let you take it from here.
Great. Hi, everybody. So like Julianne said, I am an occupational therapist. I am an executive functioning and life coach. I've worked with individuals on the autism spectrum and their family for over 10 years. I've worked in schools, private practice, parent coaching, and I've learned from experience that there are several things that are applicable across settings that make an immediate situation better for the family. And it turns out these strategies also benefit children in the long term. So my goal today is to educate you, and I'm going to ask some questions along the way that Julianne is going to monitor the chat for me, so you can individualize this information for your needs. So we're going to start a little bit. We've learned about me. I want to learn about you. Just using the chat, please answer some of these questions. Where do you live? How many kids do you have? Just any of these questions. I'm going to give everybody a minute to do so. And Julie, you could tell me what's going on in the chat.
Yes, absolutely. I'm just going to send a quick note to everybody just so that we have access to the chat.
Oops, sorry. Moved over. There we go. Yep.
Okay, we have someone who is an intern in marriage and family therapy from Philadelphia. We have a pediatrician in Frederick with 2 kids. Silver Spring, 2 kids, 1 on the spectrum, looking for new ideas. 3 kiddos on someone's caseload, so another provider looking for resources. 9-year-old son, Washington, D.C. Towson, adolescent young adults. Silver Spring, 1 child. All right, we got a good mix. Thank you, everyone.
Awesome. Yeah, we'll just kind of keep going. Let me pause that. Okay, so we're going to start with just understanding autism spectrum, right? So the DSM criteria is that there are persistent deficits in social communication and social interaction across multiple contexts, and restrictive repetitive patterns of behavior, interests, or activities. So that's sort of the criteria, and the signs under it, I didn't list everything, but I just listed things that I'm going to talk about in this presentation. So for instance, deficits in social communication and social interaction we'll talk about. Also, inflexible adherence to routines and hyper or hyposensitivity to sensory stimuli. One thing to keep in mind is if you've met one person with autism, you've met one person with autism, right? This is from Dr. Stephen Shore. Every kid is different. So maybe one kid has a little bit more social communication challenges, one kid has a little bit more inflexibility, but every kid's different. And I really want you to take this presentation and individualize it to your kid because one size does not fit all with this. Okay, the learning objectives is the first we're going to talk about why routines are critical and identify methods to build successful routines. We're also going to talk about strategies to strengthen social communication, recognize differences between hyper and hyposensitivity, learn proactive approaches to support and manage sensory overload, and finally, how to de-escalate big emotions when in public places. As we go about this, I'm going to kind of split it up into different sections. Then we kind of have a review where I want to ask a question and you reflect, and then I'll open it up to any questions about that section at the end of that section. And Julianne's going to monitor the chat. So first, we're going to talk about routines and structure. Kids on the autism spectrum disorder have a strong preference for routine and sameness. On the DSM criteria, it said inflexible adherence to routines. I like to reframe it that they have a strong preference for routine and sameness. So you might as well build off that strength of predictability and routine. The challenge and the challenge in this is to make sure that the routine is routine, but not rigidity. And what I mean by that is that the kid knows that there's potential other things that might happen, but there's a routine that they're looking forward to. So different ways you can do that is in a daily routine, talk and write down possible changes that could happen, and then model small reactions to changes and use language to reinforce those small reactions. So I have an example of a kiddo I worked with in the school system where every day he would come down to OT, we'd go and use the OT gym, he'd use the swing, and then we'd go to my office and do other things. That was his routine. The problem was we had 3 other OTs. So he never knew if he could go to the gym or not. And I was like, perfect. This is going to work to my advantage. So I'd pick him up and I'd have a whiteboard with me and I'd say, okay, the plan is to go to the OT gym, but what if we can't do that? What if we have to do something else? And he said, oh, we can go in the hallway or we could just go to your office, right? We talked and wrote down the possible changes that could occur. And then if we got to the OT gym and it was busy, I would model a small reaction. I'd say, okay, we have to do something different. And I'd use language. For instance, I'd use something to say, it's a small problem. It's a small problem. We can't use the gym. What can we do instead? And we can refer back to the whiteboard and pick a different choice. So those are some examples of how you start to build in routine, but not rigidity. Why are routines important? As we talked about, children with autism spectrum, and all of us in general, thrive off routine, right? The more predictability there is, there's going to be less stress. This also increases decision-making and tolerance, makes for easier transitions and more independence. So for the kid that I was talking about in OT, I'm going to call him Chris, right? He would come to OT and you could visually see him relax, right? He tended to stim a little bit when he got nervous or he was anxious. You could visually see him stop stimming. His rate of speech would decrease because he kind of knew the routine and what was going on in OT. Also, since he knew that increased his decision-making and tolerance to make a different choice, right? So he came to OT, the gym wasn't available, he could make a different choice because he wasn't as stressed from the beginning. I have a visual of a water glass here. I like to think of this as like your stress level, right? So maybe the stress level is about mid-glass, right? And you want to keep it at about mid-glass in order to allow for different changes to occur. So if you think about stress, maybe there's a stressful event and more water gets in the glass and more water and more water, and all of a sudden the glass overflows, right? The idea is if you have routine, then the glass stays about mid-level because the child knows can predict what's going to happen. So when something does happen that's unexpected, they have the tolerance and the bandwidth to handle that change. One way you can build routines is called habit stacking. Habit stacking is adding a new habit onto something you already do. Habit stacking can be used to chain habits together to create routines. The formula is after a current habit, I will do a new habit. So let's use an example of kids coming home from school, right? They come home from school, they're excited to see you, they put their jacket on the ground and run up to say hi, right? You walk downstairs, the jacket's on the ground, it's driving you crazy. So that is a good time to start using habit stacking. So let's say you want them to put their jacket on the hanger. That might be, at least for right now, too big of a leap. So you decide, okay, I'm going to put a bin right in front of the doorway and I want them to put their jacket in the bin. So that could be a habit that you could build. So the habit stacking formula is after you get home from school and you close the door, you're going to put your jacket in the bin. So that's what you call habit stacking. With habit stacking, I like to think of it kind of like nesting dolls, right? So you're starting with a small habit and then you're stacking other habits. So let's use an example of a bedtime routine. Let's say you want your child to put on their pajamas, go to the bathroom, brush their teeth, and wash their face, right? At first, that might be too many habits at once. So you start at the smallest achievable habit. Maybe that's going upstairs and putting on their PJs. So that's the small little doll, right? When you go, or after you go upstairs, then you put on your PJs. Once your child has mastered that, you can add on going to the bathroom, brushing teeth, then washing face, but doing it systematically and one by one versus trying to do a routine of 4 steps at once, starting at the smallest step. And you can talk to your child about what they think the easiest thing to start with is to get their buy-in. Also, when building routines, you can use a couple different things as reminders. So the first one is written or visual lists. I laugh about this one because I think of the visuals in the bathroom of how to wash your hands and things like that. Those are great if the child references the visuals, right? It does you no good if the child does not reference the visuals. You might as well then just have a very simple routine you put in place that the child can commit to memory versus having written or visual lists. But for something like maybe packing a backpack, having a written or visual list might be really helpful. Another tip about written and visual lists is if the child has to interact with that list, like check things off, or if you're using Velcro, unvelcro it, they're more likely to attend to the list versus just kind of blow through the list. Another one might be visual cues. So visual cues going back to the kids putting the coat in the bin, right? They walk in, they see the bin, and they go, oh my gosh, I have to put my coat in the bin. So that's a visual cue. Another one could be timers. And timers can be used for time-sensitive things like taking your medication, right? Or they can be used to transition to another activity. When possible, you always want to transition at the end of an activity, like a natural endpoint, rather than the middle, but that's not always possible. And what I mean by the natural endpoint is after you're done coloring that picture or after this chapter, but that's not always possible. So when you're thinking of reminders, I always like to, after the timer goes off, make sure there's 5 more minutes built in to allow for that transition. So there's visual timers, but there's also kitchen timers. The visual timers are nice because the kid can visually see how much time is left. Now, again, the challenge is the child has to be referencing the visual in order to see that. What I like about kitchen timers, though, I know you can't visually see the time, but some of them, the child actually has to turn off the timer for it to stop beeping. And that's important because, again, if the child can interact with whatever it is, they're more likely to pay attention to it. So I have a funny story is my little one was on her game and I gave her, 5 minutes to wrap up. And I said, Alexa, please set a timer for 5 minutes. So the timer goes off and I, being a good parent, turn off the timer for her. But she's not transitioning off the device. And I said, why aren't you transitioning off your device? And she said, my timer never went off. Yeah, right. So that was a parenting fail because she was so hyper focused, right? If I let the timer go
To start it again, and the other one is converting, so they'll just be two. Would like to be better at using visuals and timers. Success, morning list on iPad. Checklist to keep track of tasks have been helpful, more independent in stopping the timer and managing progress. Want to try some sort of checklist for chores, visual cues. Morning routine split into 3 parts with a 10-minute timer for each one. A successful morning is doing all 3 on time, and then he gets tablet on the bus.
That's great. Yeah, yeah, those are great. The gamifying is a great one, right? The more fun you can make it, the better. That's always, more exciting, for sure. Also, I was going to say the visual cues are huge, right? If for all of us, right? But if you see a visual, it's going to remind you. You can even make the visual annoying. So, like, for instance, if you want your kids to clean up their clothes, you can put the clothes right in the middle of the room, right? So, the more annoying it is, the more likely they'll interact with it. Okay. Oops, sorry. Okay, next we're going to talk about, actually, before I get to communication, any questions on habits and routines? I'll pause for a second.
I had a quick question just based on habit stacking. So when you talked about, the pajamas and then starting there, how
Yeah.
long would you do just the pajamas? Is that like a few days or?
I would let the kid master it, and I would wait for at least a couple days to see if mastery is there. So I wouldn't do it after the first day, but after maybe 3 days if they're consistently doing it. Also, it's important to know that this is highly dependent on mood and sleep and this and that, right? So it's not always going to be an upward trajectory, but for the most part, if you feel like they've mastered it, you can move on. Or you can have them do the next one, and if everything falls apart, you go back a step.
That makes sense. What advice do you have if the child is less verbal and can't necessarily discuss changes and that?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. If the child is less verbal, you can have visuals of different things you can do, right? So, for instance, if you are um, might have different options for dinner, right? You could have visuals for that. You could also just talk about them and not necessarily the kid doesn't necessarily have to kind of respond, but still talking through it is important. Also, just in terms of habits for kids that are nonverbal, depends on their attention, but they might not be attending to visuals. So making routines very, very concrete and small and manageable to commit that routine to memory is going to be better than having a more complex routine that you have to refer to a visual.
How do you balance accommodation versus independence? So it's hard when we're on a timeline and can't just be patient. Sometimes feels like a challenge that we help a 5-year-old on with their shoes to stay on track.
Yeah. Pick time where they can do it independently, right? So maybe that's the weekend, right? It might not be every day, but pick time and be mindful of the time that they can be independent. And also, independence doesn't mean independent from the get-go. It means scaffolding back support. And what I mean by that is maybe you help them at first, maybe you help them with most of get, you know, most of getting on their shoes and they do the last couple steps, or maybe they grab their shoes. But I would have at least a day, if you can, of dedicated practice where they know the expectation is to do it themselves. Because you're right, when life gets crazy, it's easy to help a kid, and that's okay, but having some days of dedicated practice.
I'm not familiar with this, but is this similar to chaining or could it be done with R&R?
Um, it can be chaining, so you can kind of chain, different habits together. Not actually quite sure what R&R is. If you can elaborate, that would be great.
Yeah, I'm not sure if whoever posted that could possibly elaborate on that. We did also have a comment. We use a visual board for my 23-year-old and verbal cues for morning routine, like getting dressed and brushing teeth. Oh, rituals and routines.
Got it. I appreciate that. Yeah, so chaining can be the same, right? You're kind of chaining habits together. Um, the chaining is typically more kind of with one activity. You might be like chaining kind of the steps of putting together a peanut butter and jelly sandwich or tying your shoes. But I think the same language could be applicable to routine. But habit stacking is more you taking a routine or habit in and of itself and then stacking on another one versus chaining together how to do an activity.
Thank you. I think that answered all the questions we have for now.
Awesome. Great. Okay, next we're going to talk about communication. Challenges with social communication. The biggest challenge comes down to taking other people's perspective, which is perspective taking, right? I have a picture of these children, young adults have difficulty putting themselves in somebody else's shoes. This leads to possible miscommunications at home, and also just kind of understanding other people's perspectives and also conversation skills, right? If you don't know what somebody else is thinking, it's really hard to know what to say, and what questions to ask. So strategies we're going to talk about are ways to limit miscommunications at home, helping your child understand others' perspectives, and overall improving communication skills. So with clear communication, what you want to do is have direct, clear, and concrete communication. You want to avoid indirect speech and nonverbals. So I'll give an example. Let's call him James. James is a teenage boy, and after he's done eating, he leaves his dishes either on the counter or in the sink, but doesn't put them in the dishwasher, right? And it's frustrating, right? So what you want to say is, James, it's time to put your plate in the dishwasher before you go upstairs, please. It's important to pause after James and it's time to, in order to allow the young adult or child to orient to you, meaning to actually hear what you're saying. If you don't pause, there's a good chance that your child is thinking about something else, right? So you want to give them time to orient. So that's direct, clear, and concrete. You're telling them exactly what you want them to do. Avoid indirect speech and nonverbals. So avoid things like, oh, the kitchen is a mess, right? That's indirect speech because you're hoping that James will pick up that the fact that you're frustrated, and then he'll actually know what he has to do. And there's too many things he has to kind of infer from that in order to put his dish in the dishwasher. Also, nonverbals, right? Kind of like crossed arms or eyes looking up. There's too much to infer with that. So keep it direct, clear, and concrete. Other things is set them up to get it right. But what I mean by that is sensory sensitivities in general can make listening hard. Kids on the spectrum can have auditory processing difficulties, meaning it's hard to process what somebody is saying. So make sure that you speak slowly and allow time for the processing, which is when you have the James pause, it's time to, right? Avoid drive-by instructions. So what I mean by that is, let's say James is, finishing up his food, and you walk by and say, James, make sure to put your plate in the dishwasher before you go upstairs as you're walking by, right? There's no pause, and there's a potential that that could get lost because James maybe is thinking about something else or on an iPad or just in his own world, right? And he's not paying attention to that drive-by. So that's what I call a drive-by instruction. Also, make sure it's one instruction at a time. No and instructions. So what I mean by that is, let's say you go into the kitchen and you say, James, when you're done, please put your dish in the dishwasher. Oh, also, and put your shoes in the closet and check your planner before you start your work. That's 3 instructions in one. He might get one, but he might not get any of them. So one instruction at a time is important with that as well.
I just have a quick question on that. I love the
Yeah.
pause, the James, it's time to. Should you
Yeah.
anchor your request to before you do this, like how you said before you go upstairs?
Um, yeah. Yeah. So you mean like before you go upstairs, put your dish in the dishwasher?
Yes, like instead of just saying James, pause, it's time to put your dish in the dishwasher. Should you make sure there's like the next before you? I'm just curious.
You can. It depends on the context. You know, when you talk about speaking slowly, you also want to make sure you don't use too many verbals. So that might actually not be needed, or it might be needed depending on the timing and what you want from the conversation. But you don't want to add too many filler words if you can avoid it.
Makes sense. Thank you.
So next we're going to talk about improving social skills, which is improving perspective taking. Right. So for this one, I'm going to use an example of Matthew and Dylan. Okay. Matthew really enjoys having lunch with Dylan, and they usually have lunch together every day in the cafeteria. One day, Matthew comes home and says, okay, well, Dylan doesn't want to eat with me anymore. Right. So you guys talk about it, and you learn that Matthew is only talking about his weekend, right? And doesn't give Dylan time to talk. So in order to improve perspective taking, you want to help Matthew understand how Dylan is feeling by being direct and concrete about how Dylan is feeling and what we call connecting the dots. So you might say something like, Matthew, when you only talk about your weekend and you don't ask Dylan about his weekend, he might feel like you don't care about him. So you're giving Matthew Dylan's perspective. Then you're going to layer in the result of that. So as a result, he might not want to hang out with you. So that is the result of the behavior. And then finally, depending on the kid, you can ask, how does that make you feel? Because what you want is you want it to come back to Matthew and how that impacts him. Right? So Matthew might say, oh, it makes me feel sad, or, I feel lonely, right? And he's more likely to remember to ask about his weekend because now he knows not only how Dylan feels, but how it makes him feel. In terms of resources, this is called social behavior mapping, and it's from Michelle Garcia Winner, which is social thinking. And she actually has some visuals. They call it social behavior mapping, where you map out these type of things in order to improve perspective taking. Next, we're going to talk about improving social skills in general and improving conversation, right? So the goal is to make a social situation more predictable. So imagine you walk into a party and you have no idea what people are thinking and feeling, right? You don't know what they're thinking about. Are they thinking about you? You see them looking around. You don't know, what they're thinking about. That's really anxiety provoking, right? So it's no wonder that kids on the spectrum tend to talk about what they're interested in and talk about themselves because that's predictable, right? It's predictable to talk about yourself and your interests because you can kind of predict how the conversation is going to go. So the goal is to make social situations more predictable. And the way you can do this is to role play asking WH questions. Michelle Garcia Winner calls these social wonder questions. So for instance, with Matthew, you can say, okay, well, what are some questions you can ask Dylan using WH? Maybe it's something like, where did you go this weekend? Or what did you do? Right? And that's going to get the conversation started. Think of this as serve and return, right? So you serve a ping pong, then you have the other person return it back, right? And then you kind of respond to what they said. So it's a serve and return type interaction. It's not a one-sided interaction. Like before, we're going to stop and reflect on communication. Put in the chat strategies that have been successful and then strategies you want to try / be more consistent at, and then I'll pause for questions.
Okay, so I know I have a question, so I'm going to ask that quickly while we get everyone's success stories.
Okay.
Real talk. How do you hold a boundary when they say no to instructions?
You need to help them understand how it impacts them, right? So you can't just give an instruction to give an instruction. You need to talk about how that impacts them and not be afraid of those consequences, right? Sometimes natural consequences are the best teachers, right? So something bad happens, and then you can talk about that natural consequence and why that happened because a child made a certain decision. But don't be afraid of natural consequences, explaining the why, and also figuring out what motivates the child in order to help with compliance with the instructions. But the why is really important also, because if we forget the why, sometimes, again, going back to direct and concrete, right, we might assume that the child knows the why, but maybe they don't, right? And really walking through, like, let's say cleaning your room, right? What's the why behind cleaning your room? If you don't clean your room, how does that make me feel? It makes me feel frustrated. I don't want to, you know, um, I'm a little bit more short with you, and I know that makes you feel sad, right? When you clean up the room, it makes me feel good. And then you can also talk about maybe it makes the child feel really good, right? To have a clean room. They walk in, they feel proud that their room is clean, but really connecting those dots that the no is not digging into that no, I guess.
Thank you. We have some great success stories. So one is involving everyone. Example, let's all march our plates to the dishwasher. Everyone pick up 5 blocks.
Gosh,
Another is playing story games. So playing games that allow two characters to have a conversation. The key for us is the approach with peers, making sure he's not interrupting what the other peer is currently doing. For instance, at the playground, approaching a peer and asking if you can join in and ask what game the peer would like to play. One-step directions, avoiding flyby and makings are I have her attention before giving instruction, making sure I have her attention before giving instruction. Even saying, can I have your attention, please? Are you ready? That's great. Um, One, to be more consistent, teaching the WH questions and modeling what comes next in conversation. Um, and then also using puppets before has made a huge difference.
that's
So
great.
those are
Yeah,
great.
those are great. Yeah, a couple things to build off of it. Um, in terms of the multimodal, like, and you could even use like a ball, right? Where, what did you do this weekend, right? And you throw the ball to your friend, right? Or even to you, and you respond, right? And then that you ask a question back. So you can actually use like a ball or something physical to indicate it's your turn to talk, right? Also, I wanted to mention about everybody doing something or family time. That's a great time, um, everybody, it's cleanup time, right? I know cleanup can be really, really challenging because it always seems like there's never time for cleanup and things are everywhere. But making that part of the routine, like everybody cleans up, right? So maybe the adults are cleaning up one thing and the kids cleaning up something else. It doesn't necessarily matter what they're cleaning up, but everybody's doing it. So the kid doesn't feel like they don't have set time to clean up and they don't feel like they're missing out. So that family time or that just everybody's doing it is really important. Um, it also helps just kind of make sure things get done because everyone kind of has to do it. So that's a great one as well.
Just one quick question. I don't know if you're going to get into this, but do you have any suggestions on what to do if one child does dominate the conversation and doesn't allow the other to participate?
Yeah, I would definitely try to get things like a ball involved or something so you can physically see, make it into a game, right? Of, can you ask a question and throw the ball back? But anything where you can layer in different types of supports helpful. Uh, Again, also going back to the perspective taking of why is it important to not dominate? And for some kids, you really have to layer in how does it impact me, right? Because let's say Johnny is dominating the conversation, he likes talking about himself, right? Like, and he's not necessarily thinking, but the moment that you layer in kind of how does it make you feel when your friends don't want to play with you, then that's the aha moment of, oh, okay, well, that impacts me versus like, it makes Michael sad that you're not, letting him talk might not hit as much as, oh, yeah, I do feel really lonely when none of my friends want to play with me. Okay, awesome. Anything else?
One to have more consistent, one to be more consistent and engaging in the WH questions more when engaging in conversations and requesting of wants and needs. Yes, I think
Cool.
that's great. Yeah.
Okay, I keep doing that. Okay. Next, we're going to talk about sensory sensitivities. Right? So managing sensory sensitivities. So they're in two camps, right? You have the hypersensitivity and hyposensitivity. Hypersensitivity is equivalent to walking down a dark alley, right? So imagine you're walking down a dark alley. All your senses are like on 1,000, right? You hear a noise and you kind of turn around. You see a shadow, right? And then let's say somebody like taps you on your shoulder, right? Like you jump out of your skin. That's hypersensitivity, where you feel everything. Hyposensitivity is the opposite, where it takes a lot of stimulation for you to feel something. So an example of this is, let's say you're outside and it's cold and you don't have gloves on. I know for me, I have one of those mailboxes that you have to put a key in, right? And if I don't have gloves on, it's really hard for me to turn that key to open up my mailbox. That's hyposensitivity, where it just takes a lot more sensory input to feel things. At the end of the day, it's all about functional impact. And what I mean by that is not necessarily hyper or hyposensitivity, but is your child seeking or avoiding stimulation? So, seeking is a result of hyposensitivity, meaning that your child doesn't feel something, so they're seeking it out. So this could be like movement, like bouncing in your chair, right? Or pressure. I know some kids like love, like hugs or anything a lot of pressure, weighted blanket, because they're not quite sure where their body is in space. So they're seeking pressure so they can learn where their body is in space. Another one is I worked with a girl who would smell everything, right? She'd see something, she'd smell it because again of the hyposensitivity. She couldn't really smell it, and she was seeking the smells because she couldn't because it took a lot more for her to smell different things. That's seeking. Next is avoiding. Avoiding is the result of hypersensitivity, where you feel or you hear too much. So, for instance, taste, right? I know taste is a big one, right? Where you just, the kid wants to stick to the white foods, right? The bland diet, the same brand. That's a result of hypersensitivity. Noises is another big one. I would work with clients and they would hear the humming of the fan, right? So we'd be talking and they'd be looking around because they can hear the humming of the fan. They're hypersensitive to that noise. Touch as well, specifically light touch, right? So the pressure or the deep touch is typically more calming, but light touch can be really aggravating, right? So specifically light touch for hypersensitivity. So it's about seeking or avoiding more so than bucketing it into hyper or hyposensitivity. So we're going to talk about sensory overload. Sensory overload is when the brain is overloaded by too much sensory stimulation. This can happen by a single event or by a buildup of sensory stimulation, right? It can result in things like shutdown, aggression, need to escape. So going back to the water glass, right? The water glass is half full, something happens, more water gets poured in. Something else happens, more water gets poured in. All of a sudden, the water glass is overflowing. So it could be multiple events, or it could be a really big single event that is really triggering to your child, right? A ton of water gets poured into the glass. All of a sudden, you have sensory overload. I have an example of sensory overload. My little one came home one day. I picked her up, and she went to a assembly. Right. First trigger, I had to sit still for an hour and a half. Right. Second trigger, and the kid next to me was singing loud. It was some type of like I don't know, choral concert, like an interactive thing. Next, and we were packed in like sardines. right? So she had 3 different sensory sensitivities, and she got in the car and was just over it, right? Like you could tell she didn't want to talk. She was just over it. But there were 3 different sensory things that you could see. As a result, her water glass got more full each time. So what do you do about that, right? Proactive strategies. What I mean by proactive is anticipating, right? Doing it before the triggering event. So, what I could have done, right, about the assembly is we could have talked about anticipated triggers, right? You can talk about it with the kid if the kid is old enough. If not, you might just kind of have to um, use social stories or kind of tell the kid what to anticipate. But anytime that the kid can interact, the better because they're thinking about it. So the first thing you can do is visualize what to anticipate. Okay, you have an assembly coming up. What might you anticipate? It could be crowded. There might be a lot of noises. You can also use, I know somebody mentioned earlier about social stories. You can use social stories to help a child walk through what to expect. This can be a written social story or visual, depending on the kid and their level, um, as well as visiting the location ahead of time, especially if they haven't been to that place. So I'm thinking like the first time in an airport or something like that. Visiting a location ahead of time and really practicing and walking through what could happen. But with all of these, you're helping a child anticipate possible triggers and knowing what to expect in that environment. The next thing is to request accommodations in advance. So for instance, noise canceling headphones or earplugs, maybe sitting at the end of the row, right? So my little one could get up and walk out if she needed to, right? But requesting accommodations in advance and then alert supervising adults, right? So my child has some sensory sensitivities. These are the accommodations, but please just be mindful, right? That's important, A, just so the adult knows, but B, maybe they are using their noise canceling headphones and that's okay, right? But knowing sort of why they're using noise canceling headphones so you don't have an adult say, take those off or something like that. Are there strategies to assist with sensory sensitivities? Be mindful of the environment and again, set yourself up for success. So let's say your child is sensitive to noise and crowds. Maybe go to the restaurant in off-peak hours, right, where it's not so crowded. Also, make sure to have reasonable expectations when in the restaurant. So, for instance, if you know that there's already a trigger of loud noises or having to sit still, don't ask them to try a new food. That's not necessarily the time and place to do that, right? So have reasonable expectations or don't ask them maybe to sit down the entire time. Maybe they can go and stand up, they can walk around. Also, look for sensory friendly activities. You can call and ask, but a lot of places nowadays, the Kennedy Center, different places have sensory friendly times and activities. So call and ask about those. And finally, have an exit strategy. So know a place that you can go with your child if need be, if they start to get overwhelmed or they need a break. But don't figure that out in the moment, figure that out ahead of time. So maybe it is around the corner, or maybe there is the bathroom or something like that, but figure out ahead of time where the exit strategy is so you have it if need be. I'm not going to spend too much time on this slide, but this is just a chart of different senses, whether the child is seeking or avoiding, and strategies. So I'll just give an example of touch, right? If they're avoiding touch, tag-free, seamless items might be good. If they're avoiding like bright lights, sunglasses, those type of things. So this chart will be in my presentation for later. So how do you manage sensory overload? right? So let's say your child is overloaded. What do you do, right? The first thing is manage the environment, right? So have a calming corner or a calming place that your child can go. Um, Also, you can use this again proactively, meaning throughout the day, right? They can use their calming corner. They can go to, a calming space that they have or do a calming activity in order to keep that water glass um, at at like middle, right? Or maybe even actually might pour out some water if they have time to decompress. So build in that decompression time. But ways you can do that is, again, manage the environment, have a calming space that your child likes. We have a bed tent that's really helpful, right? So we have a bed tent. Also, maybe it's movement, walking, drawing, whatever your child tends to gravitate towards that's calming, have that in the environment and have that set up for them. So maybe it's pacing, maybe it's drawing, and maybe having some drawing pages on the table for them. Deep pressure is also known to be calming, right? And that's in the OT world, right? The deep pressure is known to be calming. So hugs, there's something called a hug sack in the bottom picture. It's kind of like a body sock, if anyone's familiar with that, except this one is made for sleeping. You can see there's a little cutout for the feet. So that can be really helpful for deep pressure. Also, push, pull, and lift. That's called heavy movement in the OT world. And that's basically a child pushing against gravity, right? They're pushing against gravity, they're pulling up something hard, something heavy, they're lifting things. That's going to give them the deep pressure and it's going to help with that input. It's going to help just overall with calming. And then finally, oral motor. So things, our mouths are places that we really feel a lot of movement. So a lot of kids tend to go to their mouth for calming. So things like chewing gum or sucking on hard candy, right? Babies suck on their thumb because you get a lot of input from your jaw. So having oral motor strategies are also helpful. So as always, I'm going to stop and reflect, write in the chat, and then I'll answer some questions.
Wonderful. So while everyone's writing, I just wanted to say there was a comment about a child with ASD. Is it not necessarily one or the other, like hypo or hyper? It could be a combination of both. A lot of times.
Yeah, yeah, it absolutely can be a combination of both, and that can be it can be confusing, but I think if you bucket it as, my child is avoiding this sensory stimuli and seeking this, it's easier than using sometimes the terms can kind of feel muddy a little bit. But yes, it can absolutely be both. 100%.
Just a comment that someone likes to use a sensory swing. And then another comment that their son uses gum or Annie's gummies during school assessments to help his regulation with a non-preferred task.
Yep. Yep.
Great.
Yeah, for sure. Swings are known, especially what the back and forth movement is supposed to be calming. So rocking chairs, any type of those swings is helpful. Other things that are helpful for sensory are trampolines are great for kids to get some of that input that they need and the energy out. And again, using them proactively, right, before a hard activity or, throughout the day to keep that water glass not full.
Someone's daughter loves to pogo stick.
There
Love
you go.
that. Yeah.
Yep.
All right.
Great.
Trampoline. Yep.
Trampoline's a great one. Yeah. Yeah. Any other questions?
Not for right now, unless anyone has any and they want to put it in there. We have another sliding down the stairs, bouncing on yoga balls. I think a question is coming. One second. Do you have a mechanism to do a sensory mapping?
In terms of sensory mapping, do you mean in terms of what their sensory preferences are?
They said they're waiting For onboarding with an OT, is this something parents can do at home? But yes, they are. Yes.
Yeah, so the OTs can do sensory profiles, and that will kind of give you a map of, again, sensory stimulation. Um, they're great, right? And you can also just sort of be mindful of the different senses at home. I mean, definitely this is really good information to have from an OT, but just being mindful of kind of the different sensory stimulation and your child's response will also give you some really good information. Especially too, because you can see them in different environments with that sensory stimulation, right? So one thing might bother them, like bright lights when it's crowded because there's, two things versus bright lights, maybe when it's quiet, might be a little less. So that direct observation and just being mindful of what you're looking for is equally as important.
This is a good question. Any ideas on how to help a child not avoid certain foods of a specific color?
Yeah. So start small, right? Um, and kind of have a dedicated time to work on it, kind of talk about it, and start small in terms of the food. So introduce it slowly, and don't expect kind of they're going to eat maybe the whole thing, right? Maybe one bite, right? And then you can layer in like rewards and different things to help encourage them. But talk about it ahead of time too. Kind of like what might it taste like? What is it, what does it look like? And you can kind of talk about the texture to kind of help a kid anticipate as well. That might backfire depending on the kid, but that also might be helpful for some kids to really talk it through, about what the sensory experience might be. Maybe even you can try it and you can tell them your sensory experience, might kind of help some of the kids try that. But have a dedicated time. Maybe it's Tuesday after iPad, I try one new food, right? Also allow the kid choice. So maybe give them a choice of two foods and they get to pick one, right? What I've done in the past too is, I've given them choice of two foods, and then I give them choice, and then also sometimes I allow them to not choose something, right? Depending on the day. So the more choice they have, the better. And then you layer in first, like you're going to try this today, right? Just being systematic with it and slow.
A great also tip with that is someone said they've used a no thank you bowl before just to have the food nearby at first, so no pressure. Um,
That's great.
I know we have a few more things to get through, so this is just the last question, and then we can answer the other ones at the end. But how would you fill the glass if a child has a tendency to repetitively bounce his back on the couch cushions when he's sitting?
Um, you mean how would you kind of manage that? Is that sort
I
of the,
think so, yes. If
yeah.
whoever that could clarify just a little bit. Um, yes. How would you manage that?
Yeah, so I would either, if it's not disrupting things, let it happen, right? Let them do that. If not, is there their own bouncy chair they could have that you could buy, right? That they can do that there, right? So not taking away that input because they're seeking it, right? But maybe figuring out a better place to do that if it's kind of disrupting everything, or if it's unsafe, or things like that. Also, maybe if depending on the context, maybe using a trampoline or getting a lot of energy out first, right, might be helpful. Other suggestions, depending on the context, might be like a visual timer that, you know, try to sit and focus for 15 minutes, then you're going to get your break. So knowing sort of there's an ending to the sitting, depending. Um, so yeah, those are some suggestions.
Awesome. And then just last, there's just one more strategy that a permanent hall pass as part of an IEP has been very successful. So she can escape class when she gets overloaded, goes to
Yep.
the library guidance counselor. So yeah, that's great if that's a part of your IEP. All
Yeah.
right.
Those are great. The other thing I'll mention with the hall pass, right, is sometimes, yeah, having just a visual so the kid doesn't have to request for that break is going to be really important depending on the kid. Oh my God, every time. Good. So last one is outbursts, right? So I like to think of behavior in three separate little categories. First one is the car's going down the road, everything's good, right? The no problems. Next is the rumble strip. This is signs that things might be kind of going in a bad direction, right? It's a little warning. And then the car goes off the cliff, right? And then you have a meltdown. So you want to try to stick in first two categories. We will talk about the third category, but I kind of like to bucket behavior in those three ways. So the first one is what to do, how to keep the car kind of going down the highway, everything's good. Comes down to proactively preparing, right? Proactively prepare by using social stories, right? Visual or written, visiting a place if possible, right? Again, I know certain places like the airport, you can maybe even get like a walkthrough, right? Being mindful of triggers and accommodating if possible. So knowing, my kid is triggered by loud noises, or I'm going to a place that has a lot of fluorescent lights, being mindful of that and accommodating. Sometimes having a to-go bag with certain sensory strategies is really, really helpful because life gets hectic, right? And if everything's in the bag, then you have the bag and you don't have to think about what you need. You just have everything ready if needed. You have that. Like we talked about, find a safe space, right? So find a space that you can go if needed in that environment because you want to have that space set up ahead of time before you need it. And then practice. Practice these strategies. Practice, okay, practice wearing the noise canceling headphones. Practice if you're going to go to a space, practice going to the safe space. Practice just different things because the more that the kid gets comfortable with using the strategies ahead of time, they can use it in the moment, right? Because in the moment, they're starting already to feel anxious and overwhelmed. And then you're going to ask them to use a strategy that they haven't used before or they use rarely is not going to be as effective as if they've practiced it before. And again, depending on the kid, you can really layer in talking about when do you use the strategies, how do you know, right? Leading with curiosity and asking your kid questions so they can reflect on these different things is going to be great because then they'll be more likely to understand and see the whole picture. So pay attention to the rumble strip signs. So what I mean by that is you know your kids, right? You are the expert in your child's life. Know their signs. Maybe it is shutting down. Maybe it's looking away. Maybe it's picking at their finger. Maybe it's a shaky leg. But know the signs and pay attention to them and remove the trigger if you can, right? It's not always possible, but if you can remove the trigger or lessen the trigger, do it immediately, right? If you notice these signs are happening. Go to a safe space, right? So just give time to decompress, go to that safe space, remove those triggers. Don't let things build up, right? Kind of immediately try to remove or go to a safe space. Co-regulate, meaning model calm behavior, right? So if you're anxious and they're anxious, then it's not going to work. Model calm behavior. One phrase I like to use is lend them your calm. Even if you don't feel calm, be calm, and then they're going to be more calm as a result. I have an example of this. I was working with a kid who was starting to get dysregulated, and I, calmly, he was starting to get a little aggressive. Calmly, I moved away, right? So I was safe, and he was safe, and I think I took my computer very calmly away from him, right? And I modeled calm behavior. I wasn't running out of the room. I didn't make any sudden movements, right? I modeled calm behavior so that I could lend him my calm. And like I said, make sure the environment is safe. That's why that safe space and going to that safe space is important, but make sure the environment around the child is safe. Show your child what calm looks like and encourage what they're doing right. So by that, right, you can tell them, calm looks like, hands down, right? It looks like, shoulders relaxed, and encourage if they're doing things right. Like they're taking deep breaths. You can say, that's great that you're taking deep breaths, right? You can even model things like deep breaths, but definitely catch them when they're doing things right, versus what they're doing wrong. And then provide comfort items and sensory items immediately. These aren't conditional. So it's not like when you show a calm body, then you get your favorite stuffy, right? You're using a stuffy in order to calm down, not the other way around, right? So these are not conditional. They get these regardless in order to help them manage their emotions. So what do you do if the car goes off the cliff, right? So you have a big reaction. What do you do? No talking or limited talking, right? Because at this point, the brain is offline. So, really quick, I like to use my hand as an example. And if this is the amygdala, which is the emotion part of your brain, right? And these fingers are your prefrontal cortex, which goes on top. If your amygdala is firing your emotions, your brain's going like this, right? Your prefrontal cortex is not online. You're not thinking about things. Your amygdala has hijacked your brain. So don't talk, right? Don't try to use it as a learning moment because it's not, or limit talking, right? If you do have to talk, limit talking. Um, Time and space to manage emotion. So the biggest thing is, and this is why that having a safe space and going to the safe space during the rumble strip signs is so important because you want time and space to manage that emotion, right? You step back, you give them time and space to manage. If you do talk, talk in a quiet voice because the kid is naturally going to quiet what they're doing in order to listen to you. So the quieter you can talk, then it's actually going to help them calm down. We also talked about the modeling, and you can do that non-verbally, right? Take your deep breath, right? Unclench your fists, whatever it is, and you can just do that safely and calmly. For some kids, maybe even redirecting to something else, like a favorite movie or something like that, might be just enough to get them out of whatever is happening. Again, calmly, but you can start talking about something else. I used to work in a school where we had behavior support, and a kid would be having an overreaction and they'd be having an outburst, and the staff would be talking about the basketball game or whatever was happening, not because they didn't care what was going on, but in order to help the child redirect to something else. And they would do whatever was interesting to the child. So maybe it was Pokemon or basketball, whatever it was, right? But they used that therapeutically so the kid would start to orient to something other than their emotions. So this one, same thing. I want you to reflect. And then Julianne, I think I'll kind of talk about my group and then we can close up with any other questions.
Yeah, absolutely. So I have a question, so I might hold on to that for just a minute, and we can get to that right after. One person just noted that more and more venues, like you said, have a sensory or special needs room now. So like Disney, amusement parks, kids
Yeah.
museums. Um, I love going during, the idea of going during a calm time, doing the practice,
Yep. Yep.
identifying that stuff. Um, yeah, I know it is 1:08 and we're wrapping up at 1:15. So if people still want to put their um, success stories for this in the chat, maybe if you wanted to go on and mention your group. So Amy is going to lead a group for us, and the next slide gives a little bit more information for you all.
Yeah, one thing I really wanted to mention about kind of that trial run, you could even do something where you go and visit a place during kind of peak hours for 5 minutes or 10 minutes or 15. So it doesn't have to be all or nothing, right? You can go for a little bit just to get the lay of the land of how it might be. And you know that you're going to leave, within 10 minutes or something, right? And managing expectations around that. Okay. Actually, I forgot about this slide. Summary and next steps, right? You are the expert in your child's life, right? That's why I wanted to have that pause and reflect on there, because you guys know a lot of strategies already, right? You're the expert in your child's life. So remember that. Give yourself credit for your expertise. Share it with others, right? It's always great to have other people share what they're what they're going through, what's worked, what challenges they're having, and then increase your expertise. If you want, you can join me. I am leading a parenting group, parenting kids with autism spectrum disorder, on Thursdays from 12 to 1:15, starting February 22nd. Um, you learned a lot of tips and tricks that you can provide to your child, right? So how you can build routines, how you can help them with communication. But the ultimate goal is for your child to understand and learn these strategies for themselves and figure out what works for them. So this group is time to individually problem solve challenges, celebrate strengths, but also help your child internalize these strategies so they can ultimately become more independent kids, young adults, into adulthood.
Awesome. And yeah, so we are enrolling for that. If anyone would like to join, when I send this out, you're welcome to reply to my email. You can also go to our website, which is thechesapeakecenter.com. But yeah, we do have a question. And first, we just, again, we're wrapping up. Thank you, Amy. This has been wonderful. So
Welcome.
insightful. I've learned so much.
Great.
Moving into our first question. So, any regulation strategies for activities that require your child to remain calm and focused for long periods of time? Example is participating in chorus rehearsals for an hour and 45 minutes with a 10-minute break. And so the parent has been asked to sit in as kind of a paraprofessional, but any strategies that you would have for that?
Yeah, I would definitely talk to the school or whatever it is and talk about adding in more breaks, right? I think that might be too much, right? And again, depending on the child, you can ask, okay, what's your tolerance of sitting, right? Maybe it's 15 minutes, and maybe ask for every 15 minutes, not a long break, but going and taking a little break, and then having a social story about that, or having maybe a visual timer or something that they know that their break is coming is going to be important. But that's going to be really hard, right? That's a long time anyway to be sitting, but especially for a kid that needs to be moving, that might be really challenging. So problem solve with the school or whatever, whoever's leading these rehearsals, and see if you can problem solve together is going to be the best. Also, you can use other sensory things, whether it's fidgets, gum, those type of things as well might be helpful. Um, One other strategy is if the child is a little bit self-conscious about getting up, which happens for sure, being at the end of the row or being at the back of the room might help so they feel a little less self-conscious about that. Also sharing your personal experiences. Like you can be like, I like to move too, and normalizing that it's okay to get up and move. Or maybe standing in the back of the room. So there might be different things, but definitely problem solve with whoever's leading it. That would be my first suggestion.
Awesome. And honestly, we don't really have any more questions. Just a lot of thank yous. And I also want to thank everybody that came because we had great interaction and success stories and strategies that everyone shared. So, yeah, I appreciate it. And thank you, Amy, again. We'll go ahead and, compile everything and send this out. But it was nice being here and spending your lunchtime with us.
Yeah. Thank you, everybody. I appreciate it.
All right. Bye.